Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center and our discussion on the Argentine economy, the macroeconomics, and how that affects everything else going on in the country as well. Our event today is jointly sponsored by the Argentina Project in the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center and The Bubble. Emily Hirsch of The Bubble will be giving us her thoughts on the discussion as we conclude today. I hope we can have a good discussion amongst our panel, and if time permits, I will open up for questions from the audience, because I'm sure many of you would have some thoughts to share with the panel. Let me introduce our absolutely stellar panel here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. Alejo, Zerwanko, close, okay, is the Director for Emerging Market Strategy at UBS. His primary focus is the macroeconomics of emerging markets, sovereign credit, and as well asset allocation. He's frequently quoted in many publications. Casey Reckman in the middle is a Director of Emerging Markets on the Emerging Markets team in the Investment Strategy and Research Department at Credit Suisse. And she's also very much an expert on this part of the world, Argentina and Venezuela, coming from Fitch Ratings. So a good understanding of the dynamics behind credit ratings and economic performance in countries. Diego Pereira, on the other end here, is the chief economist for Argentina, Chile, Peru, Paraguay, Uruguay at JP Morgan. He's another expert. He's been recognized by Institutional Investor for his coverage of the region. So I must say we have an exemplary panel here, real experts, certainly more expert on Argentina than I am. My name is Meg Lunsager. I was the U.S. Executive Director at the IMF for a number of years, and so I covered economic developments in the entire world, and with a group of other executive directors, there were 24 of us representing, I guess in my time it was 188 members, we set IMF policies and voted on IMF programs, loans, to countries. So while I was executive director, I did not have the opportunity to really opine on much on Argentina because IMF teams could not even travel to Argentina for regular economic reviews, and our message was always report data accurately. Please talk to your creditors and work things out. So it is therefore a great pleasure to be here today talking about Argentina's reform efforts and its genuine desire to address its long-term problems and try and fix things. High inflation, weak economic performance, something I think everybody in this room shares, a desire for their success. IMF support for this program is very important. It's crucial. Argentina needs the IMF financing, and it also needs the IMF seal of approval, so to speak, something that hopefully will help reassure creditors, both domestic and external, and that they'll continue to make economic progress, inflation will come down, the situation will get better, and it's safe to continue financing Argentina. Now, the IMF recently increased the size of this program just about 10 days ago or so. This was with strong support from the United States. So as far as I know, the entire executive board supported it. I mean, those votes are kept private, but I'm sure it would have leaked out if there had been some real grumbling or opposition. So because it's such a large loan, the IMF also has a lot riding on the success of this program, just to show that it can help a country turn things around, make progress, succeed, and of course, every IMF loan has to look forward to make sure that there's a really good probability, very high probability, that the loan will be repaid so that it's available for other countries. Now, Argentina is going to host the G20 leaders meeting in a few weeks, the end of this month, and that's a very important signal that it's coming back into the fold of the large economies in the world. And I think a key part of the discussion there will be how interlinked economies are around the world. So Argentina, I'm sure, as host, will be pointing to all its linkages with its neighbors, Brazil's in the G20, as well as countries further away, China, the United States, European countries. So we'll be touching on many of these issues during our discussion, but I think one of the things, some of the things to keep in mind in terms of how international developments matter is think about the US Federal Reserve. It's meeting again later this week, probably won't raise short-term interest rates again until December, but nonetheless, you know, the US Federal Reserve is on a path of raising short-term interest rates. That affects Argentina. The US has imposed trade sanctions on China. China has in turn retaliated, not buying as many US soybeans, so Argentina's maybe benefited from that, selling more soybeans. At the same time, the Chinese economy might be slowing down a bit, and how will that affect countries like Argentina? So there's a lot going on in the world that does have a direct impact, and I'm sure that'll be part of the discussion. But let me start with a general question for all of you. The Argentines just modified their reform program. They've strengthened some things. They're going to have faster fiscal adjustment. The IMF upped its financial support. Just give me your general sense of how you think things are going to unfold. I'm sure as we continue, we'll get into a lot of the details of the program. But just what's your sense of how they're going to do? Why did they have to have this sort of reassessment of the program? You want to start us off?
Of course. This works? It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much for moderating. It's an honor to spend this hour with you exchanging thoughts on Argentina. So the reality is that Argentina has had a fair amount of bad luck in 2018. The external shock has been quite significant, as you rightly highlighted. The Federal Reserve started hiking rates at a faster pace than was priced in by the market. The level of tensions between the US and China were very different from the one experienced in 2017. And this led to a very significant sudden stop of capital flows in Argentina. $35 billion of portfolio flows came in 2017. Portfolio outflows is what we're experiencing in 2018. So even though, by and large, the Argentine policy-making environment was improving, this external shock changed the plan very, very significantly. Now we have an IMF program that is stepping in for that private capital that has stepped out. The amount seems to be adequate, but the program is still very much subject to domestic implementation risks and external shock risks. I think you pointed out rightly so, the Fed, China, the US. I think I would add Latin American politics, in particular, what's going on in Brazil, and the likelihood that Bolsonaro is able to implement Social Security reform, unleash animal spirits in Brazil. This is also going to be very important for the Argentina outlook. So in summary, I think we should expect a baseline scenario in which the country muddles through and policy continuity is guaranteed through Macri's term and beyond, but there are risks in terms of their ability to implement, number one, domestically, and what would happen if we get an external shock of the size that we got already in 2018.
So, Casey, what do you think of their chances for success? You've been following developments there closely for years. I mean, do you give them a high probability of succeeding?
In general, I would concur with Alejo. I don't have an overly bearish scenario, but I also find it challenging to feel like I have a lot of visibility beyond the end of 2019. And I think that's an important consideration. Obviously, the IMF program goes on longer than that. So, that gets you into some of the domestic related risks. It brings you into the implementation risks. It brings you into the political risks. I think that the commitment by the Argentine authorities to the program and to its metrics is very strong. And I think that especially with 1 month now that we're into the phase 2 of the IMF program and they're meeting targets and the commitment on the fiscal side is there, I think in general people are feeling more comfortable with Argentina. Then you get into the questions about the external risks, and I think Alejo highlighted some of the most important ones. Our house view on a lot of those risks are still to expect a gradual tightening from the Fed. We're have a fairly positive view on Brazil, which is very favorable for Argentina. Had Brazil gone the other way, you may have had a real headwind for Argentina. So, conditions are challenging, but there are elements which are supportive of Argentina and elements that could be more complicated for Argentina.
Diego?
So, hi, thank you. I want to express also my thanks for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here. So, I concur with my colleagues. Let me add maybe more layers to the discussion. First of all, I don't think everything was bad luck for Argentina. I think that there were some policy mistakes. In particular, I still remember, December 28th, 9:30 local time, December 28th, 2017, 9:30 local time, when the inflation target was revised, That started to, that put some orange flags in terms of policy making in Argentina. Then we went through the central bank easing monetary conditions early January. Argentina issuing $9 billion also in January. Market conditions deteriorated already February, March. In March, the central bank started to intervene in the FX market in a more aggressive manner just because they weren't able to hike the policy rate. That created more policy flags. And then, yes, when the external situation changed in a very hefty manner, when the dollar, the US dollar, the broad US dollar started to appreciate strongly. In April, yes, we started to experience the capital outflow that Alejo mentioned. So first of all, it wasn't all bad luck. And this is important going forward, because going forward, as Casey mentioned, in Argentina next year we have a key event, the elections. And the market is clearly, not only the market, the IMF, by the way, is clearly kind of, there's one Argentina until the ballotage, the second round next year, and then it comes 2020. And in 2020, the challenges are really important because, yes, the Fed is likely to go into restrictive territory in terms of the policy rate. What that implies for capital inflows or flows into emerging markets. The US economy likely to decelerate as the Fed hikes. And in 2020, Argentina needs, being Cambiemos 2.0 or whoever wins the election, Argentina needs to tap markets again. They need to issue, in my numbers, around $17 billion gross issuance. Their issuance in the IMF numbers, I think 16, kind of similar. So that is the key. That is the first quarter 2020 is likely to prove us wrong or right. I share, by the way, the view of my colleagues, but that is the key quarter for Argentina in my view.
Well, actually, this is really interesting because, in my years at the IMF, my concern was always the country itself, whatever policies are, they need to restore the confidence of their own citizens. Most time capital flight starts domestically because people in the know live in the country, and it takes a little longer for those outside to catch on. So I'd like to ask you, Diego, we can start with you. Just what do you think are the key things that will restore Argentines' confidence in their own economy? Will lead them to hire more people? There are some positive things going on. Exports are being helped with the peso depreciation this year. The peso has stabilized a bit. Actually, fiscal revenues have, strangely, as expected, benefited a bit from the inflation. So what do you think will give Argentines themselves a sense that things are turning around and they should be more comfortable about, hiring people or spending money? So what are the key things?
So I think we can differentiate the near term, the medium term, and the long term. Near term, so far so good in regards to the currency stability. some issue in there if you want in the medium term, but so far so good. I mean, the peso has stabilized, gained around 10% since the new program was implemented in the first month of the program. Second paramount, we need to see inflation decelerating in November and December. Inflation October will remain pretty high, around 6% month on month. In my estimates, November, December, I see monthly inflation, I'm talking about averaging 3%. That will be positive for locals, okay? Seeing inflation deceleration, I have 2.4% month on month average for the first quarter next year. We need to see by the end of the year the LELIQ rate, former policy rate, not a monetary policy rate anymore because of how the new program is designed. But we need to see LELIQ rates converge into 16% and to be below 60% in the first quarter next year. If not, some doubts in regards to the time consistency of the monetary program will gain traction. And that's the near term. Medium term, we need to see the fiscal consolidation unfolding, more or less in line with the program. We need to see that these risks in terms of the implementation of the program are, not in there, and hopefully Brazil is going to help, as you pointed out, via exports. The harvest is going hopefully to help, fingers crossed, first quarter next year. And then we have the elections. Whatever happens after the election will determine the long term.
Well, let me turn to you, Alejo. Do you think, I'm always a little, when I see that, you've had the depreciation, exports are probably benefiting, how much does that increase in exports lead to more jobs, a little bit of more stability in wages for those in the export sector? When we think of Argentina, we tend to think of agricultural exports. So, whereas in the United States, the focus is manufacturing exports, even though, of course, the U.S. exports a lot of agriculture too. So how will that depreciation, the better performance expected and on exports actually help with this creating confidence? Yes, it brings in some more cash in the export sector. Does it generate the kind of jobs that then translate into more people being employed and a little bit more confident that their incomes will be sustained?
So when you get such a sharp depreciation of the currency in a country like Argentina, the pain in general outweighs the gain, particularly in the near to medium term. The gain comes with a lag. The increasing competitiveness is real. It will lead to higher exports, but it takes time to materialize. In the shorter to medium term, it generates a lot of instability, in particular because Argentina has a debt structure that amplifies external shocks and reacts very, very badly to sharp depreciations of the exchange rate. From 2017 to 2018, debt to GDP will have increased by 25 percentage points. This is a very, very large number and has to do with the fact that the debt structure of Argentina is very geared towards dollar-denominated debt and short-term debt in local currency at very high interest rates. So to your question, I think there's more pain to come from the depreciation of the currency. The gain will take more time, and Argentina crucially needs to work on improving its capital structure at the sovereign level. It needs to work a lot harder in making sure that external shocks are not amplified by the debt structure and are mitigated instead by the debt structure. In particular, I think Argentina needs to put as priority number one to start developing the domestic debt market, that is debt in fixed rates, local currency, longer duration, in order to mitigate future external shocks that without a doubt will take place at some point in time.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was always, I thought, a very important point, developing the domestic money markets, bond markets, so that not just governments would have more stable financing in the domestic local currency, But also, businesses would have a benchmark then, and you'd get the bond market developing that would be helpful to the private sector as well, not just to the government. So I think that is a very important point. But what do you think, Casey? Do you think that they'll be able to do this? I mean, will this, in this, let's look just really through 2019 right now, just in terms of getting that spark that might make people start to feel better. So that's more of a negative signal in the short term. What might be a positive signal in this short to medium term?
Well, I think, as Diego pointed out, if you're looking at the currency stability so far, I think that's a meaningful place to start. And that's something that the central bank president has highlighted also, that he thought that it was very important to stabilize that, and that the destruction to the economy of continued foreign exchange rate volatility was going to be more painful than the impact of having a tight monetary policy now. So they felt like that was the first place to start. I think that is important for a lot of Argentines. Getting to this question about manufacturing or exports contributing to employment, I think that's where the Brazil story comes in again. Brazil is Argentina's largest trading partner. A lot of the exports to Brazil are concentrated in the manufacturing sector. Those agricultural exports are not going to Brazil. So it's the exports to Brazil that tend to be more labor intensive and more meaningful in that regard. So if Brazil's economy picks up speed, if its currency is strengthening, that can be beneficial to Argentina. So I would see that as a potential upside. And the export, I would also point out that the export component of this plan is so crucial, because it's part of rebalancing the external accounts. It's part of generating the fiscal revenue, right? Half of the fiscal consolidation is meant to come from revenue side measures for 2019, and the vast majority of that comes from tax on exports, this temporary tax on exports that they've imposed. And it's also obviously material for growth.
Right, okay, so that is key. And that is, I thought, one interesting part of the IMF program that they went along with, tax on exports. Normally, the IMF would be urging export taxes to come down because you want to create incentives to export. Does that tax create a disincentive to exports? Well, maybe not in a significant enough way here to outweigh the positive revenue effects that the exports will still continue. So I do think that's a really interesting question, to get a sense of how that export tax, and I'm not quite sure of all the details of it, generate revenues versus how much of a disincentive, but we'll have to see. Yeah, what do you
it's on
think?
primary
Yeah.
exports, basically. So,
Yeah, so
I mean, again, if we assume that weather conditions are going to be normal standard in the first quarter next year, then Argentina should see exports growing by $6 billion or so.
yeah, that'd be great.
So and bear in mind that the collection is in local currency, so the devaluation of the peso also helps.
Right.
So now, in regards to non-agricultural based exports, then what Casey said. Now, sadly, we are, and going back to Brazil, yes, Brazil is very important, but sadly both Argentina and Brazil are very close economies.
So, Casey, coming back to your point on Brazil, those manufactured exports then are not subject to the export tax. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point, and that might be then helpful. But we'll have to wait and see what happens on Brazil, right,
Well,
in
and
terms of how they put their new
Right.
government together.
And that's another point, is if Brazil is successful in reforming its economy and opening up its economy, I wonder if that might also put pressure on Argentina to do the same, to maintain competitiveness, or might help reinforce any kind of reform momentum in Argentina.
I
Well,
think
we can
Casey
hope, yeah, Alejo,
makes a
yeah.
great point there, because if you think about the fiscal adjustment that is planned out until 2020, it is very ambitious, but it's of relatively low quality. And by this I mean it is financed on the revenue side by a one-off tax on export, because this is going to dissipate over time, because it's a nominal tax on how much you're supposed to export in peso terms. And on the revenue side, there's a lot of intra-public sector transfers and decreases in CapEx, capital expenditure. So this is not the best quality of a fiscal adjustment you can have. And you're gonna get to 2020 with a very serious need to adjust social transfers. which constitute, for instance, 60% of the year-to-date primary spending in the country, 60%. This has not been touched by the fiscal consolidation plan until the end of 2019. So to Casey's point, if Brazil is successful in passing a social security and pension reform, maybe this helps the Argentine policymakers to push their own social security and pension reform, which is indispensable for a higher quality fiscal consolidation beyond 2019.
Well, actually, one of my questions was, in the more shorter term, the fact that the IMF program is protecting, making sure that the most vulnerable are protected as this adjustment program goes forward. So how much will that help with domestic confidence? You know, does the government, let me put it this way, get credit for protecting the most vulnerable in the economy under this program?
My 2 cents on that is I think that will help maintain social stability in the difficult months of November and December in Argentina. It will help in the quest to, you know, continue and get reelected or get a continuity of policy making in 2019, 2020. But it is a headwind to a good quality fiscal consolidation plan that has to address social transfers.
And the question is, how clear is that to the general population that at one point or another that'll be coming? So that's something. Watch Brazil, watch what's going on in other countries. I mean, frankly, this is an issue pretty much in every country around the world in terms of how do you protect those basic social services while strengthening the fiscal accounts and making sure you have an adequate domestic revenue base that'll enable you to satisfy those demands over the long term. Diego, did you want to add something here? Or?
Yeah, two things. I mean, one is the tax pressure in Argentina is very high. We're talking about 42% of GDP. So the quality of the adjustment in the period 2020, 2024 will likely determine how much this country can move forward with the CapEx, the investment savings relation, meaning whether the country will be able to invest properly in order to increase TFP without creating another current account deficit imbalance. This is very important from the macro standpoint. Bear in mind, I mean, the current account deficit in Argentina, one of the reasons that people point to, you know, vulnerabilities of Argentina going into the sudden stop that we have seen for emerging markets and for Argentina in particular starting the second quarter this year, people pointed to the current account deficit. The current account deficit, 65% of the deficit, or the widening, came on the back of stronger imports of capital goods. So at the end of the day, you need in this economy to process public sector saving in order for the private sector to be able to overinvest vis-a-vis the savings flow. Okay, so it's very important. Second point in regards to Brazil, I cannot forget that Brazil passed labor reform some quarters ago. Argentina did absolutely nothing. That is going to create a lot of pressure on the Argentinian labor market starting next year. So you need to understand also that, I mean, yes, it's good to have the biggest economy in the region processing supply side reforms. Yes, paramount, but you need to move forward. I mean, you need to have
Keep up with that.
And you need to go. You know, you cannot be behind the curve. That's my point. If not, you will need more effort on the real exchange rate in order to compensate the private sector lack of TFP vis-a-vis neighboring economies.
Well, let me just ask all of you, I mean, to jump in, but basically wage negotiations are starting now, or some of them maybe have been concluded, and this is, you know, government workers as well as then I guess private sector, and you also have those in the formal sector that actually are counted as employed, and then you also have an informal sector, those people working for themselves. So based on what you've been saying, how worried are you about these wage negotiations? And are they keeping in mind, those that are unionized, or even the non-unionized ones on their own, what is important, not just wages, but also, future pensions and other benefits? I mean, how do you see that unfolding with these negotiations underway now when inflation is a key concern, yet I'm sure job security is on everybody's mind too? What do you think? Anyway, Casey?
I would just point out that this government has made an effort to change the thinking around wage negotiations to make them more forward-looking. They started structuring agreements that had clauses that were triggered if inflation was over a certain threshold, and they had made some progress in that regard. I think it's going to be very difficult to continue with that, given the way inflation is running this year. So I think that is an important challenge that they're facing. I think there's going to be more inclination to want to be compensated for 2018 when you're going into 2019.
What do you think? What do you think?
I think Casey makes a great point. It might have to be qualified by remembering that the labor market, by and large, is on the weak side. So the bargaining power of labor in such a difficult economy is not what it used to be a year ago. So I think there's arguments in favor of these wage negotiations going on the upper end of the spectrum, but at the same time, the labor market leaves a lot to be desired in terms of its health right now, and that argues for somewhat lower. The IMF estimates 25-30% paritarias results in the coming months. It's an ongoing process. I think that's a sensible estimate.
Okay. Diego, yeah?
So, couple of points. I think in regards to real wages, we have basically seen the trough in October. There are ongoing negotiations. We have seen during the weekend the judicial employees, for example, having wages 40% higher. And now the truckers union also asking for 45. I think they're going to have it. So I think on average, we are going to end the year with real wages down around 10%, okay, which is meaningful. Very, very strong contraction in real wages. For next year, I'm expecting real wages gaining, how much? Maybe 5 to 8%. It's an election year. And so October, again, October, we saw the trough. November, December, real wages recovering. January, February, sort of a stable. Then March, we have the first paritarias kicking in. So yeah, I think it would be fair to assume 6-8% real gain in real wages. One point though, we are used to think about real wages gains from the demand side. No? Okay, so real wages higher, so therefore that fuels consumption, that is good for activity. I have some doubts in how higher positive real wages will interact with a new monetary rule, okay? Because the new monetary rule basically, as you all know, basically fixes in nominal terms, the monetary base, although in the second half of the year it's going to grow 1% month on month. But I'm not so sure that firms, in particular small and medium firms, will be able to pass the increase on their cost, on the cost side of their equation, to the final consumer. So this time around, I think there are some elements, at least in the system, that may, if you want, offset, I'm not sure 100%, but at least offset in part, the increase in real wages on consumption via, higher unemployment, for example.
Yeah, so we're not going to see the kind of consumption-driven recovery that was an important part in the United States, and we're seeing, that continuing right now. So it's going to be a tough haul across the board as you look at the different areas that might generate, let's say, the kind of positive signal that then might help spur, improved confidence in the rest of the economy. So we'll have to hope that policy implementation sort of across the board, whether it's the inflation, keeping inflation from increasing, keeping the peso relatively stable, maybe even appreciating a bit depending, and to have that be the kind of positive signal then that generally everyone picks up, whether it's consumers, producers, exporters, we'll see over time. But I do think one of the things that I always puzzled about is workers moving to the informal sector, right? So if they leave the formal sector, regular job where they've got a regular weekly paycheck, and they go out and sort of work on their own, whether it's, Uber drivers or whatever it might be, what's your sense? Is a lot of that happening? And as people do that, how, let's say, responsible are they about paying their taxes and contributing to the kind of things that come back to the formal economy? I mean, what's your sense, those of you who follow, and of course, those in the they're in the informal economy, so there's no real data on that in terms of being able to go and say, oh, here are their incomes, here's what they're paying in taxes. That's not quite so easy to identify. What do you think, Alejo or Diego, whoever? Alejo, jump in, yeah?
That is a serious issue in all of Latin America that becomes even more severe in times of economic stress. So I think you make a great point by highlighting that. And going back to Diego's comments a few minutes ago, the reason Latin America and Argentina have such a meaningful informal economic sector has to do with the rigidity of its labor markets. It's so difficult to hire, so difficult to fire. It's so costly to get anything done. We need to change that. Brazil has advanced at the margin in the direction of changing it, and Argentina hasn't really picked up the call yet, right? But this has to be brought into the priority list together with the other points I highlighted earlier.
Like the infamous doing business report of the World Bank, and I admit I didn't go and check where Argentina is on this, but Casey and Diego? Yeah.
And I think this discussion about labor reform in Argentina also brings up a relevant point, which is that the government doesn't have a majority in the Congress. So they tried to pass a labor market reform, and it became very much diluted along the way. And one of the parts of that was to create an opportunity to formalize labor without paying a penalty, or there was a certain. It was sort of like the I keep thinking blanqueo, and I can't think of the word in English, but like a amnesty. Thank you. Right, for the labor sector. So I mean, those ideas are out there, right? The government tried to put through a very robust reform, and in the end, as we've said over and over, there's not much to show for it. But some of that also is a product of the political environment.
Diego?
I think we have a couple of points. Formally, obviously, the formalization in the labor market correlates with a business cycle in Latin America. So when you go into a recession, the formal market suffers, people go into the informal market. You have the cyclical aspect. But there's one structural aspect that is really important in Argentina, and that is going in the right direction, and is part of the institutional advances, reforms that this administration has put in the last year. So don't want to sound super critical, because it's not the case. And one key aspect is, for example, to look at the ratio of electronic money to cash in the economy. And the central bank has this series, and if you look at that ratio, that basically correlates with the formalization not only of the labor market, but of the economy as a whole, to your point about people paying taxes beyond labor market related taxes. The formalization of the economy is growing, and that ratio of electronic money to, let's say, cash in circulation is basically at the top of the series starting in 2002. So there is
Positive.
It's a very positive one. It's a very positive one. It's a structural one. It has to do with the good reforms, institutional advances that Argentina has seen in the last 3 years. And yes, Argentina has improved in all the business-related indices, indicators, or the likes, not only the World Bank, World Economic Forum, and the likes. Yes, still not in the level that we would like to see Argentina, but improving, and this is important. I mean, this is important, and that's why I'm saying what I said at the beginning. We need to differentiate in the long term, the elections, whether this institutional improvement that we have seen in the economy, in the rules of law, if that is going to consolidate going forward.
No, I think that's a really important point because, I mean, for all governments, there's a benefit to being able to do a lot of things on the administrative side that you don't necessarily need to argue out in your parliament or your Congress, your legislature. So that, and a lot of that can be at times incremental, but still very positive, and over time have the kind of benefits that are helpful. So whether it's changing some administrative laws, that sort of thing. But of course, when governments are stressed and there's many big problems, it may be hard to devote the attention to that. One of the things I just want to, just as an aside, and ask, I know there have been some corruption concerns. There have been the bribery scandal unfolding. I mean, as far as I can tell, not on the scale of what we're talking about in Brazil, but just is that a signal of, in terms of how public confidence is in the government and their ability to deal with problems like this? How do you see that? Is it possible to make enough progress that people think, okay, those officials, they're going to do their jobs, they're going to be responsible, and I'm talking about at all levels, not just the president and the cabinet. I mean, what do you think, Casey?
I think the wheels of justice move very slowly.
Okay.
So I think things are moving, and that is a positive. But I think it was part of the confidence shock that led Argentina to return to the IMF. And it's also material for the outlook in the context of the public-private partnerships, which the government is depending on to replace some of the capex that is being cut back, because a lot of the companies that were involved in the initial round of projects, 6 road infrastructure projects, are involved also or implicated in this, to date, what we know about this scandal. So it's relevant in that sense. Some of those projects, particularly the ones involving Chinese, are still moving forward. The government's trying to put together a trust structure to insulate the financing risks from corruption risks, trying to follow models we've seen in other countries in the region. But it has posed yet another headwind.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. A lot of these public-private partnerships go forward, the idea being, okay, the financing risk is on the private sector, it's not going to be on the government, when the reality is there are contingent liabilities that the government is picking up. So let me just ask that broader question on the capital spending investment projects. I know a lot of it's externally financed. The Chinese have been very active. What's your sense in terms of how much can they keep it going? Do they need domestic financing? Even when there's a foreign invested project like that, there's still a domestic spending element to it going forward, whether in terms of maintenance you need either private sector, government, state and local governments, the provincial governments. So what's your sense that that might be a positive in terms of what can go forward, or is too much of it tied up in some of these other problems or domestic financing issues? What's your sense? Diego, I'll start with you this time, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, sure, but may I go back to the
Yeah, you may, of
previous
course,
question?
yeah.
It's still good with time.
Yeah, no,
so
we're
I
good,
can-
we're
okay.
good, yeah.
So I think there's a phenomenal advance in Argentina. I mean, to your question about, how the judicial power is addressing the corruption in prior terms, I think that is phenomenal. And yes, I tend to agree that the justice tends to move in a very slow manner. But in principle, that is okay if all guarantees are provided. And I think it's really good to see that finally Argentina is advancing. Finally, hopefully we are going to have some responsibility. We are going to have some accountability. And yes, I completely agree. There is a near-term drag on activity, but that's exactly what you want when you look at the long term. And when you think about FDI in Argentina, Well, guess what? I mean, you want to see that the judicial power advances on corruption. You want to see that measures are taken on institutional basis level in order to make sure that if you invest today and you're planning to start taking profits, 10, 15 years from now, that rules are clear. So I think that is a major gain for RG. Now, in regards to the financing, there's one problem with Argentina. One of the reasons for why, as Alejo depicted at the beginning, Argentina was one of the first countries, emerging markets, to suffer from the capital flight is the lack of domestic savings. Domestic savings onshore. No? Argentinians residents, they have, 3 years of savings in terms of flows. 60% of GDP, give or take, a little bit less, in savings, but offshore. Problem is, onshore, not that much. So the financial market in Argentina is pretty shallow. Credit to GDP, banking credit to GDP, 13%, give or take? No, a little bit higher because of the revaluation of the dollar credit, no, in terms of GDP. But the point is, yes, you need the rest of the world to finance. So far has been financing the public sector, but you need the rest of the world to finance the private sector. And in the meantime, Argentinians need to stock savings, hopefully onshore, and that is related to the currency value and developing the local curves and the likes.
No, I do think that's very important to have your own citizens. How can you expect foreign investment if your own citizens aren't interested in investing in your own country and want to move their money offshore? But Alejo, you wanted to make some comments here?
Just to emphasize Diego's point on the of course short-term headwinds that the corruption investigations generate, but this is a clear long-term positive in line with how we analyze the situation in Brazil. Lava Jato has been incredibly damaging for economic activity in the near term, but it builds considerable credibility looking ahead. The other path through which corruption investigations are material for the outlook is the political outlook. I'm sure we're going to talk about that in a minute, but just to maybe go ahead of myself a little bit here, the allegations against the past administration are pretty serious. And even though so far the numbers show that Cristina Kirchner has maintained the core base of 25-30% of the electorate, I believe that the ceiling is going to be a lot harder than it used to be before these allegations have come to fall.
You mean in terms of increasing her numbers?
Correct. It's going to be very hard for her to go above the core constituency. Yeah.
So this is, one of the things that I think is so important for domestic confidence to feel, make sure people are paying their taxes, that they do feel part of it, bringing their money back and investing it in their own country, saving in their own country. And this is something that, many Americans don't really comprehend because we have such a big economy, people save their money here, they invest in the US stock market. They don't understand that, it's not something in the US that people do, is move their money in and out of the US, move it to euro accounts or pound accounts. Yeah, it's just not in Americans' nature, but it's very much in Argentines' nature.
There is for the economists in the audience. There's a concept that is a home bias. That you as an investor, you tend to invest more in the assets of your own country because institutions. You have a different perception vis-a-vis the rest of the world. In Argentina, it's exactly the opposite. In Argentina, you have the foreign bias. You want to have your assets somewhere else.
Although I would simply qualify that statement marginally, since the amnesty program that took place a year ago due to tax considerations, many Argentines abandoned their significant home bias, and it's been a very painful ride since then. Because you have to remember that year to date, the Argentine equity market is the worst performing major equity market in the world. The Argentine currency is the worst performing major currency in the world. And the Argentine sovereign bond market in US dollar, the same conclusion applies. So for those who abandoned that home bias, it hasn't been a pleasant situation.
Okay, so again, that real uphill challenge to restoring Argentines' own confidence in their own economy for many different reasons. And in my many years at the IMF and at Treasury before that, I did see how long that could take in countries at times. Sometimes a shock therapy would work, do a whole bunch of things all at once, and everybody's things are cleaned up, people are gonna pay their taxes, the government's gonna, and they wanna be part of it. We need to get to that point in Argentina where everybody wants to be part of it and be part of that success. And so I do think everybody's, very much pinning their hopes on this economic program, the IMF involvement, the very clear, I'd say dedication, intent of the authorities to make this work. But as we're hearing here in this discussion, it does take many, many different elements. But I want to come back to something that several of you have mentioned in terms of the foreign investment. All right, if it's going to take a while for the Argentines to have enough confidence to do some of these big projects, the government to have the funding to do big projects, it's CapEx, capital expenditures. What's your sense of China's intentions in Argentina? This is something that I do find absolutely fascinating. China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's not just in the Pacific, it's global. So they are doing some of these projects in Argentina, and some of that's able to continue to go forward because they're not reliant on funding from within Argentina. But what's your sense of the strings attached to that? I mean, is it something that's very popular in Argentina? Are they all comfortable? Because I know in other countries, Malaysia has pushed back a little bit, Sri Lanka. Some countries have gotten a little leery of some of this Chinese investment. What's your sense of the feeling in Argentina for the Chinese involvement in some of these investment projects? And I'll open the floor to whoever wants to jump in here.
I think at this moment it's pretty welcome. The president of the Central Bank of Argentina is in China this week, right? And talking about
a deal to sign. We'll
right,
come back to that in a minute.
But there's that. But there's also, again, going back to the situation with the PPP. I mean, people are pinning their hopes on the Chinese-run project to be the one that leads the way at this stage because of delays and issues in some of the other ones with local partners. And I've heard people locally also expressing hope that the Chinese would take on more of those projects or become involved in more than one of the projects. So
Is it clear what the terms are of this investment?
and let me just qualify what I said with, that's thinking from the perspective at the high level of seeking investment, right? How locals feel about having Chinese come in or Chinese companies, that's a different story. And I would also add that, I hear from Chinese colleagues from time to time that there's a growing concern, not concern, but a bit more of questions about why are we investing so much abroad. So
Oh,
When they do have needs at home in China, yeah. Alejandro,
Just
you want to jump in?
maybe two comments. I fully agree with Casey. I don't sense there's an anti-China investment attitude by either Argentine policymakers or the general public. And so Chinese involvement is welcome. There is, however, I think increased scrutiny worldwide on the small print based on some of the examples you brought up. Second point has to do with, a geopolitical tightrope that Macri at this point has to walk through. And that has to do with how much do I want to get involved with China because, at the same time, the Trump administration has been so supportive of Argentina, of the IMF program, so it's really not easy. I'm sure some people in this room are making a great job in making that transition possible.
Interesting. So this will be something that we'll see unfold over time then. But since we have mentioned the central bank governor being in China, and we have the G20 meeting coming up, I think one thing that's been important for the news in terms of getting a positive story out there is this swap agreement with the Chinese. And it's not long-term balance of payments financing, but it is a boost to Argentine reserves as they swap Argentine pesos for, I presume, dollars, that the Chinese are willing to swap dollars, not just renminbi. But, what give us a sense of how you see what the benefits are of that swap agreement. I mean, the U.S. Federal Reserve had a number of swaps in the crisis, and how, mainly with advanced economies, but also with a few other large emerging markets. But they don't anymore with those emerging markets. So what's the U.S. Federal Reserve? So what's your sense of this swap arrangement? It might be useful if one of you just sort of explain a little bit what this is. I don't know who wants.
My understanding is the previous line that was actually closed by the former government was a local currency for a local currency swap. Okay. And that can, correct me if I'm wrong, but the component, they're just counting in the reserves, that swap. Now, that brings up the distinction between gross reserves and net reserves, because that is a liability that typically would be deducted from net reserves. So if they close a new deal, it would increase the level of reserves on a gross basis, but not necessarily on a net basis.
Yeah, thank you, Casey, because I do think that's a very important point, because you do get that news in terms of deal signed, Chinese have increased their swap agreement, right? And so gross reserves, the number goes up. The renminbi can now count as foreign exchange, just like the dollar, euro, yen, right? But because it has to be swapped back at whatever the maturity is, usually these are 6 months, but can be rolled over. The question is then, analysts like our panel here, of course they look at net reserves, right? When you're advising clients on where to invest and you look at, or let's say bonds to buy, and you're looking ahead to see, can the Argentine government pay back those bonds, pay the interest, pay, maturing bonds, they're gonna look at net reserves, what's available.
And it's still a positive development. Yes. That doesn't make it a negative, it's still a positive development, but it's just important to make that distinction.
Yeah, so, but let's talk a little bit more about just that debt outlook in terms of how Argentina's gonna manage, the rollovers it has to do just in the coming period, as well as the net new financing it has to secure down the road. The IMF in its program has to assert that, there is a probability that Argentina, comfortable enough probability Argentina will return to the markets. They're a little less sanguine about that now, and the new IMF program makes the point about, well, there's enough financing coming through to get them through the program period, like the next 12 months. But nonetheless, the IMF is looking beyond that to, will we be repaid? Because the funds, the money that the IMF releases has to be paid back over 3 to 5 years from when it was drawn. So it's not a long-term loan. But what's your sense of, a little bit on the debt side? I mean, you're all very much experts on this. You're all advising clients on what to do. You're trying to, you have investment bankers out there who are underwriting new issues. How comfortable do they feel about Argentina being able to manage that? So let's just talk a little bit about that in terms of the time frame, what some of the key crunch periods are, and the sense of what the key signals will be that will keep those foreign investors involved. Diego, do you want to start this time?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of points. The first one is, as we discussed previously in the panel, I mean, debt to GDP in Argentina is going to reach levels that merits the that is sustainable, but not with a high probability statement of exceptional credit access of the IMF. In my numbers, a little bit higher than the IMF baseline. I see gross debt to GDP reaching 86% of GDP by the end of this year, starting to decline by the end of 2019 as the currency appreciates in real terms and nominal GDP in dollars moves higher. More importantly, you have to remember the debt structure in Argentina beyond the currency. There is a relevant share of Argentina debt, treasury debt, that is in the hands of the central bank and the FGS, which is a portfolio of the ANSES, the pension fund. If you assume that that percentage of treasury debt is going to be rollover, if you assume that rollover risk is zero, then what is relevant for the market is, for the sake of the argument, let me call it net debt to GDP. And I calculate that threshold to reach around 55%. That's debt of the treasury with the market bonds and with international financial institutions, no? Bilateral, multilateral, the IMF, SBI credit is in there. So that level reaching 55% by the end of this year, 52% by the end of 2019, and converging to something like 48, 46%, 3-4 years down the road. But in here comes paramount for that net debt to GDP trajectory to go lower, to have primary fiscal savings, to have a primary fiscal surplus of.
Explain what that is? Would you
So,
please explain
yeah,
that? to
sure.
the audience?
You have the fiscal balance of the treasury. Is basically, for the sake of the argument, let me just break it down in between, you know, your expenses, X interest, your revenues, okay, and subtract your expenses before interest payments, interest on debt, okay? So that is the primary fiscal balance, okay? Once you add to the primary fiscal balance what you're paying in interest to serve your debt, then that's the overall fiscal balance, okay? So before interests, you need savings, you need a surplus, you need that your tax collection basically comes higher, larger than your expenditures. And in order to have that downward trajectory of debt, to make debt sustainable in time, you need, in my numbers, more than 1.5% of GDP in primary fiscal surplus. So, those two comments, and
Right, because,
for
yeah,
my,
when you're
the
running-
interesting answers, I mean, I leave it for my.
Yeah, when you're running a primary deficit, then you have to borrow more just to pay your interest too, as well as, you know,
Correct,
the
to
rest of it.
serve your
So
debt
you're
and you pay
adding to your debt. I mean, your point is getting enough of a primary surplus so that, you know, you can pay your interest as well as then start whittling down the overall level of the debt. And that's always been a challenge in many, many countries. So thank you for clarifying that. But it is interesting, because you think 55% net. Well, there have been plenty of other countries that have managed that's not an impossible level. I mean, it kind of depends on, you know, how much, what the term structure in terms of, you know, amortizations and the state of the market. Will foreign investors, those holding the debt, be willing to turn it over? Will banks, pension funds, whatever? So again, it comes back to those signals of confidence. What gives the rest of the world the confidence that, yes, they're on the right path. Yes, we're going to get to that primary surplus next year, that things will get better, the economy will be recovering. Yes, I'm willing to, you know, allocate whatever portion of my, you know, emerging market portfolio to Argentina, as well as getting some of the Argentine money to come back, right, to Argentina itself. So I think that's a really important point. But one thing I wanted to touch on before we move on is just the domestic banking system. And, you know, we haven't mentioned that at all, and I think it's because it's not the problem it's been in many other countries or was in the past. But why don't you just, you know, give us your take on the domestic banking system? I mean, this certainly was a problem in Europe over time, you know, in the many of those programs. We still see a number of countries where perhaps, you know, the banks are better capitalized, but not enough. But how is the domestic banking system in Argentina, and are depositors still keeping their accounts there? I mean, your point about, you know, Argentines are always ready to move their money out, but in terms of the level of deposits, the sense of the capital of the banking system, is that something to worry about? We haven't really touched on it yet, and it has been in many other countries, but I don't get the sense it is so much in Argentina. Alejo, well, you want to start us off?
If I may go back for a minute
Yeah, oh,
to
you
the
may,
prior topic,
absolutely,
and then
yeah.
I'll address that question. I think talking to international investors regarding market access in late 2019, 2020.
Yeah.
They're looking for two things, right? One is fiscal consolidation, and the second one is political continuity, because it matters for fiscal consolidation.
Indeed, yeah.
And so this is what everybody's looking at. By and large, the international investor community thinks the fiscal consolidation in 2019 is feasible, challenging but feasible. There are a lot of question marks on what's going to happen on the political front. We're going to talk about that. Regarding the banking sector, in Argentina, and I think Diego briefly touched on this, it is a sector that it's relatively small compared to the size of the economy. It hasn't been able to lever up credit to GDP from the banking sector, very constrained. Surprisingly, to your point, the level of hard currency, that is dollar-denominated deposits in the banking sector, have come down, but remain relatively surprisingly stable in my view. So people haven't gone to the bank and taken out their FX deposits, or for that purpose, peso deposits, right? And so it doesn't seem to be the key source of instability in Argentina. I think the key source of instability in Argentina is, in my view, the currency composition of sovereign debt, and how any external shock that we get gets massively amplified by the fact that we have so much debt in US dollars. The fact that, you know, we like it or not, the IMF is going to lend us 57 billion US dollars. I mean, that is, it's appreciated. Thank you very much, IMF. But at the same time, we need to work on avoiding this amplification of external volatility that borrowing in a currency that's not yours generates. So that's, to me, way more important than whatever happens in the banking sector. There could be things going wrong, but
No, and that's what I pointed out earlier. I mean, IMF monies, and this is going to be substantial, as you point out, does have to be paid back over by 5 years from when it's drawn. So that's going to be built into all your projections as our experts here are doing their jobs, looking at, and it's all on the IMF website. This is what, you know, because they've drawn this much, this is when they have to repay it. It's all laid out there, and you can make those projections. Diego?
Argentina should start to repay to the IMF second half 2021,
Right.
and then in 2022, $16 billion or so, so on and so forth. No, key, one point, I mean, in order to follow up on Alejo's comment, time deposits in Argentina have increased notably since the new monetary program has been implemented. And this because for the first time in, I don't remember how many years, maybe since 2002, 2002, yes, time deposits are basically providing or offering real positive rates on local currency.
local currency
Local
interest
currency I'm
rates,
talking
yeah.
about. Local currency I'm talking about. So this is very important, because if you really want to start incentivizing, you know, saving in local currency, you start by doing this. I mean, the former president, Sturzenegger, so 2 central bank presidents ago, he tried to move forward with this idea. He couldn't. Under Caputo's 2 months, obviously the urgencies were different. But with this new monetary program, this is unfolding as we speak, and this is a very good development. Again, I'm not talking about the level of the rate. The level should, as said before, should move lower, but it's about the differential vis-a-vis inflation, now the real rate, and that real rate is positive for the first time again in many years.
So if they can maintain that, you know, as inflation comes down, then the rates on the bank deposits come down after that, right? So they are protecting the depositors. That will be an important method, important signal to Argentine citizens to keep their money in these accounts. And that's very important for the health of the banking system. So
For the
thank you for explaining that.
The
yeah.
returns of the banking system may suffer a bit, but what is important is that if you really want to create value on your currency needs to pay you. If you save in your currency and your currency is going to pay you below inflation, then guess what? Then you go for hard currency.
Then you switch. And as you have pointed out several times, the Argentines are experts at switching back and forth, something that's a little bit alien to most Americans, but absolutely. Well, I do want to leave some time for questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask all three of you, just how do you think the domestic politics are going to unfold? I mean, it's very hard for me to see, I mean, it's a mystery in my own country how politics are unfolding. We'll find out more tomorrow here. But what's your sense of, domestic opposition? Would someone or something, some new part come out of the blue, or how do you see? I mean, we had a little bit of a discussion of, Madam Kirchner and her ability to, increase her rock solid base. But what do you all think? Well, let me start with you, Diego, on that side. We'll come back across, and then I'll open up to the floor.
Okay, so I'm not a political analyst. No, for starters, let me hedge myself.
But you have to pay attention.
No, I need to provide a view. So here's how I think about the Argentinian constituency, the population right now. I think of 3 blocks, okay? I think of, let's say, the incumbent block, okay? Then you have the Kirchnerist, Cristinist, as you would like to call it, block, and then the Santa in the middle that, for the sake of the argument, let me define or call it traditional Peronism, okay? So by defining 3 blocks, I think we are going to have in 2019 basically a similar scenario that what we had both in 2015 and 2017 for the midterm in 2017. So I think we are going to have 3 presidential candidates, let's say. Okay, so the incumbent, President Macri, going for re-election, or if things don't pick up, maybe someone else, but for the time being, everything points to President Macri going for re-election. Then Cristina Kirchner likely running for president. And in the center, in the traditional Peronism, so far we are not seeing a strong leadership for the time being. There are efforts, they're trying to coordinate, there are several numbers, so likely the primary election will define who is going to be the candidate for this center block. My base case scenario, given how both President Macri and Cristina Kirchner are sort of polling right now, there is a tremendous noise in the polls, as you know, but trying to extract the trend from the noise. Everything points, with information available right now, that we are likely to have a ballotage in between the incumbent and Cristina Kirchner, okay? Again, bear in mind, the political cycle is going to be long. As we have discussed in the last minutes, there are a number of risks that we need to take into account in regards to how the macro cyclicals are going to affect the intentions or the willingness of population at the moment of casting the ballot. But I don't think there is enough time for someone outside of politics, outside of I don't have the definition right now, but I don't think someone new, okay, is going to pop up right now. There were talks about, for example, for those familiar, Marcello Tinelli, TV presenter and the likes. Frankly, I don't think there is time. The political cycle in Argentina kicks off as soon as in March. Because next year it's not only that we have the presidential election, we have elections in 20 provinces. The first province having elections is Catamarca in March. Everything, and then in April we have 2 other provinces, May, so on and so forth. So the political cycle starts very quickly after lawmakers return from vacations, boom, everything is going to be politics, and I don't think there is time. I think that the candidates are likely to be the suspects, and in that sort of ballotage, Macri against Cristina Kirchner, given what it was commented before in the panel, the high rejection for Cristina Kirchner, it's likely for the incumbent to win again.
Well, we'll ask you about that a year from now. Casey, what do you think?
I share the same base case, and I would add add that the consensus when you talk to local political analysts also is that there is not a figure, an outsider figure, who's today positioned to amass support quickly enough to have a material impact on this election. But I do think it's interesting to look at what's going on with the traditional Peronist opposition and whether a real solid coalition will be built there or not. I think a lot of the figures in that group represent fairly diverse views. So that's part of the reason I do believe ultimately we're more likely to see a repeat of 4 years ago than to see the incumbent competing with one of those options. But if that were to be the way it played out, and you were to have the incumbent against a Peronist coalition that had a solid platform and had a united position, and it's not too late for that to happen, then it would be a more challenging runoff for the current administration.
Look, you covered a lot of ground. There's not a lot of additional color from the domestic perspective for me to provide. I just wanted to remind everybody of the importance of the external sector in whatever happens in Argentina next year. The U.S. economy is set to slow down. The Fed is set to continue to hike rates. Tensions between the U.S. and China will remain. We just need to hope that none of this gets too unfavorable for the Argentine outlook, because if we do see a recovery, economic recovery in Argentina that takes longer to materialize, or yet another very strong external shock, then the baseline scenario that was just described, which I very much share, no longer applies.
All right, well, it's something everyone will be paying very close attention to. But yeah, Emily, you have a question?
Yeah, before we talk too much about politics, I just wanted to get the panel's opinion. Thanks. I wanted to get the panel's opinion on the impacts on the economy of the sort of sustained high prime interest rate. So I think it's still above 70. I checked like last week, so it could be 112 by now, right? So how much of the economy, especially the small businesses and the providers to the larger business, are financed by bank loans or financed by then alternative things like factoring or deferred checks? I want to know how big you guys think that market is, and then how high the interest rate is for those people who are, the providers of bottles, et cetera, who finance by factoring or deferred checks, and then what you see, if any, sort of a risk in the break in the payment chain.
I would start by saying that credit to the private sector is around 15% of GDP. So in that limits the impact. But obviously, there's a big difference between having rates at 68% and having rates even at the 30% where they were previously. So, where in most countries, a quarter basis point hike has an important impact on the economy. In this case, much less so, but we've had a magnitude of increases that's quite significant. So you can't automatically dismiss the transmission given the magnitude of the increase in rates that we've seen.
I mean, it's pretty clear that these interest rate levels are asphyxiating for the private sector, and it's clearly not sustainable. By and large, I believe the market as well as policymakers understand it's a transitory measure to stabilize the situation, and that hopefully in a couple months' time, these rates are going to start coming down. But this is part of what's behind the sharp contraction of economic activity that will continue.
How big do you think it is, though? Like people who don't get bank loans, factoring or check cashing, how big is that market?
I don't have an exact number to share with you.
But what you're pointing to is something that when systems are under stress, you tend to see more of that happening, as opposed to the normal, go to a bank, get a loan, or issue new bonds or whatever. So you're seeing, I think, more. But again, Diego, you want to jump in?
So to be completely frank, I mean, one of my comments, I put emphasis on the fact that, at least myself, I have to be very humble here, I'm not sure, I don't have high conviction of how this monetary rule is going to interact with increasing costs. I mean, when I refer to higher wages, okay? And it's because of that, precisely what you're saying. I mean, that the cost equation of small firms, medium firms is already under stress because of financial cost. The financial cost attached to not only, asking a bank for a loan, but I mean, if you are providing an input to a factory as a small, medium enterprise, a service or whatever, you usually charge that 2-3 months later. So you're applying a financial cost to that. So it's not that you're forced to go through the banking system in order for the payment chain to be compromised because of the very high level of interest costs. So it's for me, it's one of the things that we need to discover. I don't have a strong conviction in order to answer, but I think it's the main risk going forward, and we are going likely to have more information on this front by December when we have data for November. But it makes me feel anxious about activity. Activity next year, the IMF put out a forecast that is, for some people, very, create a lot of anxiety, minus 1.7% year on year, if I recall correctly. And that is taking into account that the primary sector, agriculture, is going to contribute with 1.8%. So if I have less of a contraction than the IMF, okay, something around 1%. We are working on the year ahead forecast, so that might be revised. But what I'm saying is that domestic activity in Argentina is going to suffer a lot, and a lot comes from the monetary rule that was put in place temporarily in order to provide some sort of an anchor for the currency. Sorry, I don't have an answer to your question, but that's a key risk.
Let me get some more questions. Cynthia Aronson, the head of our Latin America program, we'll start with you and then come over here on this side.
Thanks, Meg, and thanks to all of you for these great presentations. I have a question for Alejo, which has to do with the relationship really between Argentine politics and economics. You mentioned that investors ask you principally about two things. One is about fiscal stability, and the other is about where things are going politically. And then when you also mentioned the importance of Argentina's getting a handle on its fiscal situation, you mentioned social transfers. So my question to you, which is the million-dollar question I think that the IMF has always gotten through the history of these stabilization programs, is how do you cut social expenditure going into an election year in a way that helps preserve the possibility that a government that has been invested in these reforms will actually be re-electable?
Well, the good news is you don't have to under the current program, right? They move from a primary fiscal deficit of 2.7% of GDP in 2018 to 0 in 2019 does not contemplate almost any reduction in social transfers. As I think Casey rightly described, on the revenue side, there's a lot of export tax help. On the expenditure side, there are inter-public sector transfers and CapEx reductions. So you can make it through the election year without jeopardizing social transfers. My comments were more looking ahead, 2020, 2021. There's no more room to improve fiscal numbers unless you take this seriously, unless you think about the pension side of the equation that is rightly, as you pointed out, it's affecting most countries in the world. We're all living longer, fortunately, and so you cannot retire at 60 anymore because otherwise governments will go bankrupt. So to your point, and to keep it narrow, we don't have to, and indeed the IMF program contemplates some buffer in case you need in an electoral year to support social transfers, 0.2% of GDP explicitly under the program. But we are not done. in order to guarantee the sustainability of public debt, in order for the country to be able to come back to international capital markets, you need to do more. And this more will, in due time, involve social transfers.
So Cindy, I think that's a really important question, because then does it become part of the political discussion? Is anyone brave enough to say, bring it up? Because of course, they'll probably feel it won't help their election prospects if they're saying, and you know, going forward, we're going to have to really across the board take a rethink on how we handle pensions. Generally speaking, politicians in most countries don't like to bring that up, yet, as you point out, it may come more quickly after an election in terms of needing some resolution. We have a question over here as well. Would you please identify yourself to all of us and then ask a question?
Yes, Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. I was wondering, could you give us a sense as to whether the huge technology markets and relatively educated young population could be a great opportunity, particularly with the G20 coming and sort of, you know, giving a focus to the whole region in terms of potential strengths of that sort?
Right, Argentina, I mean, they tend to have a pretty good education system, be highly educated. What's your sense?
My 2 cents there is that's actually one of the bright spots of this southern cone in the last few years, the developments of tech hubs in cities like Buenos Aires, the famous Silicon Valley in Santiago, Medellin in Colombia, places in Brazil also advancing in that regard. Yeah, it's happening, and the good news is when it comes to technology, you can leapfrog, right? You can make a lot of advance at once without having to wait a long time for that to happen.
And with a quick payoff.
With high payoffs, yeah. That said, it remains a relatively small size of the economy, so this is not going to save the day, at least in the very short term. But I do view it as a positive.
Yeah, we have a couple questions back here on my left, on the aisle there.
Hello, good morning. My name is Hernan Pioti Lopez from Fundación Geo. I'm here with the Progress Group. Which is your opinion about new regulations that let companies that make exports turn their export dollars into pesos if they have 10 years to do that? Which is your opinion and the impact in your opinions ahead?
So in terms of your export revenues, when you convert them back to the domestic currency, to pesos, well, it's not mandatory when you earn those dollars.
It was.
But not anymore, right?
I would just point out that I think that's been, in terms of unwinding capital controls, that's been an important signal for investor confidence. And also, I mean, when we look at supporting investment and supporting capital inflows going forward, it's important to have credibility around that kind of regime as well. And when you look at for example, the MSCI index, which is in emerging markets or has various equity indices, they upgraded Argentina from frontier market to emerging market, which makes Argentina eligible, or means that certain investors who have requirements on what they can invest in now have access to Argentina as well. And it broadens the pool of investors that can invest in Argentina. So in general, the elimination of those sorts of rules is positive for developing the business and the investment climate.
Right, if you're confident you can take your money out of a country, you might be willing to put it in and invest it there, knowing that, you know, your future returns you can bring back out. So that is a very important signal. We had more questions on the left.
My name is Gustavo Rojas from American University. My question is, it seems to me that it took a lot of time to Macri to start the fiscal program and the structural reforms. And if you think the gradualism was an error for them.
My 2 cents here, it's very, very difficult to run a counterfactual exercise. What would have happened if? they had started earlier. I think developments this year reflect the fact that it had its costs, but it's very hard for me to give you a definite answer of what would have been the alternative path. By and large, I do agree with you that the gradualism led to significant external vulnerabilities for Argentina, and when external conditions changed, the country suffered significantly as a result. Now, again, the counterfactual, had they started more aggressively, what would have happened in midterm elections, right? Would the government had been able to stay in place until today? It's almost impossible to.
Quickly, Diego.
Very quickly, I think it's important to define gradualism. I mean, if gradualism is keeping the overall fiscal deficit unchanged, then for sure Macri should have done more. If gradualism is, cutting the primary fiscal deficit, they did some effort. But the problem is that, as Alejo pointed out, at the end of the day, what matters is the overall fiscal deficit. That is basically what creates the vulnerability. And so, again, define gradualism, and then we can continue with the discussion.
I think we're going to have to wrap up now, so I'd really like to ask Emily Hirsch with the bubble to give us a few summary remarks. And I'm sorry for those of you who had questions I didn't get to, but I'm sure you'll be able to reach all the panelists if you need to follow up. So Emily, please go ahead. And thank you very much for co-sponsoring.
Yeah, no, maybe I asked a less boring question at first, more people would still be here in the front seats. No, I wanted to sort of close out by thanking the Wilson Center. So I'm one of the co-founders of The Bubble. If you haven't checked out The Bubble, we are a digital media company founded in Argentina and expanding through Latin America, providing the news in English with a bit of a smile on your face, if you will. A little bit of an informality that I think in today more than ever is something that the news needs in order to hit home with people. If you can tell from my accent, I am not Argentine. I'm actually from the Washington area. I graduated from the School of International Service at American University in 2010 with a degree in international economic relations. And then I moved to Argentina, which is, or was especially at the time, basically macroeconomic Candyland. So everything that I'd seen on the pages of my textbook was happening one place, then the next place, then the next place, hyperinflation, multiple exchange rates, social crises, fiscal crises, debt crises, no IMF. And when I founded The Bubble many years ago now, it started by writing a cheeky economics column under the moniker of Bianca Fernet. The Bubble's come a long way from that point to where we're able to participate with groups like the Wilson Center to bring a face of Argentina to the English-speaking world and provide context for the events that are happening so that people who don't have the benefit of 8+ years now that I have to kind of understand why what's happening is happening and what's going to be happening in the future. Being able to come to this event gave me the opportunity to visit my family. And yesterday, my brother-in-law woke up and set out to replace a light fixture in his house and replace a broken refrigerator. He spent the whole day at Home Depot where they didn't have the part he needed. The thing that he bought didn't fit the sizing. The screws weren't put on properly on the light fixture and it fell on his head. And at the end, he'd somehow blown up the circuit. And I said, well, you just had a regular old day in Argentina. Because when you work in Argentina and you actually run a business in Argentina, it's a constant battle uphill. And some days you feel like you've put in so much effort to have things be a little bit worse than when you started the day. And that's just a reality. But having now lived overseas for 8.5 years, I'm kind of coming back to the US and coming back and traveling to other countries. I'm seeing where there's things that Argentina has learned from in the last 10 years with regards to populism and nationalism that are actually lessons that the rest of the world should pay attention to. We talk a lot about social media companies like Facebook and Instagram, but if you look at those companies' balance sheets, they're advertising companies. We, as the citizens of countries, we're no longer consumers of the news because we don't pay for it. So rather than consuming something, we're actually the product. When we read the news today, we are the product that media companies collect information on, define our audience, and then sell to Instagram and to Facebook. The more sensational headline, the better. And since nothing is free, and if you're not paying for it, somebody else is paying for you, and they're paying for your eyes, and they're paying for your opinion, and they're paying for your vote. When we talk about the challenges to stability in Argentina and what comes next, what comes after 2019, and can Macri win, I personally think that there is a lot of instability hidden under the surface of some indicators that don't capture some of what I see as the next challenges or the next crises in Argentina. The high interest rate means that the people who sell the bottles and the paint and the ink and the parts to every single company that we want to export aren't going to have access to those things. The most important part, or a key point in what's a barrier to foreign direct investment, sticky permanent investment rather than just government debt, are the barriers to entry, like the inability to import capital goods. And that's not a policy decision. That comes from the fact that there isn't money to pay for these imports. Having an understanding of Argentina's macroeconomy requires an ability to take a lot of different details, put them together, and then make a decision, and it's never easy. Talking about who's going to win the next election in Argentina and what's going to happen to Argentina in the future makes me think about what Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg said about moving fast and breaking things. In the case of media, these things that he's broken are institutional strength and credibility. Populism isn't just a move to the right or a move to the left. It's a move to leaders who are allowed to make things up, tweet their mind, and not be held accountable by facts. And nationalism goes hand in hand with populism. Today in the news and in the media, it's no secret that we are in a post-truth world where the news has no customers, only a product to deliver to whoever's willing to buy you. When you look at what Kirchnerism did to Argentina for a decade, they sort of led credence to this idea that why work to make things better if you can just make up whatever you want and say it's amazing? So what's going to come next in Argentina for this year is recession and the poverty that comes with it. If you're financing your business is going to run into trouble unless you have savings undeclared overseas. Macroeconomic stability is not going to be achieved if the chain of payments breaks, and that's the next big risk that we really need to be looking for. Back with Macri coming into office and being elected by a democratic country, Argentina made a clear decision politically to turn away from populism and face a very difficult reality. I think that we should support Argentina and follow that example to not be perfect, but to be willing to improve. So with the bubble, we hope to see Argentina emerge as a leader in Latin America that reforms and sticks with it. The biggest barrier to Argentina is uncertainty. As we sort of heard, Argentines need to come home and invest in their country, but you'd have to be an idiot to put all your money in pesos and stick it in a bank in Argentina. It'd be dumb. It'd be an objectively stupid thing to do. And on the other side, Argentina asks, what can we do to make the world think we're credible? It's not have a crisis. Just have a little bit of time go by. And that type of thinking, that type of need to sort of reduce bureaucracy and create conditions where foreign direct investment can be made, where foreigners can buy companies, can buy land, can invest in capital goods, that takes time. And populism and the speed with which the news cycle is expected to move today doesn't lend itself to that boring, reliable, slow-moving institutional strength that's really needed to bring Argentina past this era of crisis after crisis after crisis. And that comes with the decision that we all need to make as a society. If we're content for news and media to turn citizens into a product for sale. We, not just Argentina, are in a post-truth world. And being post-truth destroyed Argentina's institutions. And rebuilding them takes longer, is more expensive, and is harder. Certainty versus uncertainty can never be had for free. And so I hope that we see Argentina come out of these crises, and I hope that we see not just a return to, I mean, it's not a return to anything in Argentina. Argentina's had crisis after crisis after crisis since I think they started teaching macroeconomics. And the point is, we need to have a return to trying to be better and not trying to be perfect. And we need to have respect paid to and give a chance to the people in Argentina who are willing to work hard to tell the truth and make things better over time and not look for some quick fix. So thank you for your time. Thank you, panelists. Go Argentina.